My name is Kate Darian-Smith and I'm Professor of History and Cultural Heritage at the University of Melbourne, and I'll be chairing the proceedings this evening. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Andrew Saint to the lectern. Andrew Saint is General Editor of the Survey of London, described as the nearest thing there is to an official history of London's buildings. The Survey of London was founded in the 1890s and produces detailed architectural and topographical studies of London in very, very handsome illustrated volumes, and its 50th volume on Battersea was released in 2013. The survey has been supported by English Heritage and now is based at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. And Andrew was previously Professor of Architecture at Cambridge University and is the author of numerous important works on the history of architecture and architects. And he also writes on architecture for various more popular publications in the press. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Andrew forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Councillor Ong, and thank you all of you for coming to hear me tonight. I feel very much as a warm-up act because I'm going to talk about London, obviously not Melbourne. I don't know anything about Melbourne, except I've now learned how to pronounce it. There are just a variety of about 4 topics I thought we could talk about in my presentation, which may or may not relate to Melbourne, but the first of them I think very clearly does. And I, in a sense, want to say it's a very difficult problem which London faces and Melbourne faces also, and I don't think London in any way has got it right. So in a kind of a way, what I want to present you is a case of a real problem and a difficulty which history has shown is very difficult to resolve in all growing cities. At the top is the City of London, which of course is not the whole of London, it's the CBD, very small area of total London, as it was in 2010 or thereabouts, black and white picture. And what you see is that there are high buildings all over the city, around the back of the Pauls, and in the far distance you can see an area which some of you may know about called Canary Wharf, which is the centre of our Docklands development there. At the bottom at the moment, well, that's London as it is today, seen from Waterloo Bridge in 2014. So in those 4 years, admittedly these are taken from different angles, there have already been dramatic changes. And I think what these pictures show you in quite a simple way, and any major city would have the same kind of issues, is these incredibly large and important, and we can't ignore that they're going to go on happening, big buildings are going up in a way in which they have very little good relationship to each other, and in general are there's very little overall coherence in policy in most cities. They find it extremely difficult to make them. They overlap, they're not in the right places, and the kind of rules that are set up in order to make them, to place them, are in a way not clear rules at all, which either developers or conservationists can get their heads around at all. London has had very, very odd and strange, and I suspect a unique way of trying to go about controlling its high buildings. And that has been done through what's called the Heights policy of viewing corridors. The argument being that there are important, significant buildings, particularly in the city, of which St Paul's Cathedral, our St Paul's Cathedral, of course, which you see there on the top slide, is the focus of the thing. It's important that there aren't high buildings that get in its way, either in front or behind. And so there's been other buildings that have a similar heights policy attached to them. So people have elaborated these incredibly complicated rules for viewing corridors of significant buildings like St Paul's Cathedral, Tower Bridge, the Tower of London, etc., which you see on the lower slide to the degree you can see it. And these have been quite ingenious, and I think have actually saved some buildings from disastrous. But actually, it's a very peculiar policy indeed, because it really sees sees the heritage as kind of buildings which are in a painting, as it were, like a picturesque backdrop in a painting by Constable or something like that. And if you look at dear old Mr. Parker Bowles Mark II's A Vision of Britain of 1997, a lot of his very interesting, and I think much maligned interest in architecture, saw the City of London very much in terms of St Paul's Cathedral, for instance, as a kind of cutout against which he wanted to preserve from high buildings. The silhouette was the important thing, not the building itself. And that has struck me as pretty peculiar, apart from anything else. And it actually has not ended up with a situation in which any coherence has arisen in high buildings policy at all. So here you see another view of the City of London from the near Tower Bridge, in fact, just to the right. You see the Tower of London itself in the right-hand side, and then you get this conglomeration of all sorts of weird buildings, some of which are of real merit. The Gherkin, the famous Norman Foster one, is slap in the centre there, but others are really absolutely dreadful, and nobody's actually sorted out how to do this. In the old days, up to the 1930s, there would have been a very clear height limit, and people said you can go up to 100 feet, no more. After the Second World War, different planning rules came in, and I'm afraid fairly chaotic results have followed from that. The other thing I'm very keen to say, I don't think it applies quite to the same degree in Melbourne, as far as I've seen in my few days here, is that the tall buildings issue is not just about the tops of buildings. It's not about buildings in the long view. That's part of the viewist heresy of the difficulty about tall buildings. It's also about the way they hit the ground, and it's about their relationship with the neighbours. Now, here you've got a grid. You've got something rather like Manhattan, where I think you can get very elegantly placed tall buildings in the right place, in relationship to the street fronts. You've got a basic rectangular city system. In the City of London, you don't have this at all, and you've got buildings of all sorts of different scales coming in at all sorts of different angles, and the result at ground level is a total mess. For instance, if you take the one on the left there, which is called the cheese grater, that is actually the permanent solution of the building you see at the bottom there. That's not temporary scaffolding at all. That's how it hits the ground, and that building's only just been opened, so some of the major offenders are very recent ones. That one on the right is better in some ways. That's the bottom of Norman Foster's Gherkin, so-called the Swiss rebuilding. But even then, you've got huge problems about the relationship in scale between the base of the building, elegant though it is in itself as a kind of mathematical thing, and the rest of the buildings around it, some of which have a real distinction. And of course, this is a more cliche kind of shot. Often, a building can be such as to completely overwhelm what's next to it. This is the most famous of the new high buildings in London, the so-called Shard by Renzo Piano, who's an architect of international reputation, which overwhelms what's around it. So you're very aware, you're almost cowering in the shadow of this gigantic thing. And it's extraordinary that this has been allowed in the centre really at all. And there's going to be much more, just like Melbourne. London is in a huge state of development and so forth. There are alleged to be up to 200 new buildings of height being at some stage of planning at the moment. So there's a big concern and a big anxiety. And they seem to be completely arbitrary in their placing. Of course, you can't tell developers where to go and build because they have to find a place to build. This is a goods yard site which is being developed, and it's natural it should be developed at this stage. But the placing of these buildings seems extraordinary. This scheme has not yet happened, but it's probably going to happen. And if you look at the kind of mock-ups of the pictures, you also see that the relationship between what you might call the historic railway viaduct, as you see at the bottom, and these buildings on top is actually a complete mess. Now, who do we blame for this? Do we blame the architectural profession? The planners? I don't know, but it ought to be better in London, and I hope you're going to get it better in Melbourne. But I can see from just reading The Age today, you've certainly got this problem here as well, and it needs addressing very, very fast. So it's fantastic we're having this conversation tonight. There was a moment at which it looked as though London might do something quite sensible, which is say, okay, we've got to have high buildings. The financial people say, if we don't have high buildings, all the financial industries are going to go to Hong Kong or Frankfurt or somewhere. So let's put them all together. Let's put them in a new development in the Docklands. And this is what happened in the early 1990s. But of course, they didn't stick there at all. And even there, it's a problem because, of course, London has got an enormous heritage. It's got 5 UNESCO sites, of which I think 4 of them the UNESCO has threatened in some way or another to take away the heritage designation because of the effect of tall buildings in their backdrop. This is the so-called Maritime Greenwich UNESCO site. There's the Canary Wharf development as it is pretty much today in the background. So again, you've got this problem. To some degree, it's a problem of the telephoto lens. But when you're on the top of Greenwich Hill, you're sure very, very, very aware of this kind of Manhattanish scene in the background, and it's not satisfactory, and it's too late to do anything about it. Well, that was the main topic I wanted to address from a London point of view, and I hope you'll be able to compare your experience here with ours. I wanted to talk more briefly about a couple of other things. One is whether the present obsession in all great successful Western cities with the high density, vibrant, young street cafe life is a sufficient answer to the notion of a civilized city. I'm showing you here a picture of Richard Rogers because he, I think, perhaps of all architects anywhere in the world, is the person who's been most brilliant in articulating this vision. And it's a very compelling and fascinating vision, which to some degree comes out of this very interesting man's personal past. He is actually half Italian, and he was brought up in Florence and Venice, and he sees those cities in some degree as an ideal of the civilized city. When you've added the sort of modern energy of America to it, and his whole propagandizing for a modern city of this kind has been enormously effective in London politically, in a number of publications, and of course there have been some very special buildings by him as well of very interesting kind. And for Rogers and people who think in his way, the juxtaposition of the old and new, quite chaotic in a way. Here you see a medieval church tower, a little bit of his Lloyd's building and the Gherkin in the background, is an excitement. It's part of the thrill of the city. The young people don't want stodgy planning of a kind of or very organised kind. They want unexpectedness. They want to be able to turn the corner and see something surprising. And to get the city to work, it doesn't really very much matter to him and people of his thinking that you have a lot of old buildings which you respect. You've just got to have the buildings well used. And that's a 1950s building, the Festival Hall, the great musical, main musical concert hall in London, with crowds in front of it of a kind really, when I was younger, 20, 30 years ago, you simply wouldn't find, and they're there the whole time now. And that's a huge manifestation of success. But, of course, any vision of the city which sees it as being used in a particular way is always going to be a bit narrow, because people are of many kinds. Cities are where we all live, nearly all of us nowadays, and we have very different moods and temperaments and needs at different periods of our lives as well. And where I think you can say, over the last 100 years, Britain, and to some degree London, has actually done very well, is in catering for what you might call the suburban aspirations of its population. Now, of course, in Britain we don't have the space you do here. Nevertheless, Britain is the place where the Garden City movement originated, where the idea was that cities shouldn't be larger than a certain size, and beyond that area you should have a lot of green space available to them, and the density should be kept low, and people like to live in low density areas. And it's an extraordinary story, this. Not all of it successful by any means. But as a result of those policies, which were brought in after the Second World War, London, which is a city of what, 8 million, 10 million or something like that now, got a green belt, which despite little pockmarks of development around it, more or less holds. So compared to any other European city, it is extraordinarily, of its size, it is extraordinarily compact. It's got a greenery all around it to a remarkable degree, and there's a break before you come to cities around it. Now, I don't know whether you want to discuss this evening, but I think the idea of what goes on in the suburbs is just as important a subject as what goes on in the city centre. And for Rogers, the suburbs are a boring place where dreary people live. It's all happening in the city. And of course, apart from anything else, the city is in danger of getting overheated, and people have jobs and need to have jobs in other places as well. Cities aren't unique metropolises anymore at all. And there's a lot of interest, actually, even now, in reviving the Garden City movement in Britain, as you see here in these pictures of some projects have been done for a recent economics prize promoted by a think tank in London, reviving the garden city in a more sophisticated way and linking it in with existing moderate-sized cities, which often need a lot of economic help within the periphery of a larger city. So I think this is part of the debate which perhaps is relevant to you at all. The last thing I thought I would just say is a completely different thing, which is that I guess a lot of us worry in Britain, and I suspect it applies to you too, is that heritage and conservation of buildings particularly, I'm not talking about the natural environment, we have such a fantastically special natural environment here, it can't be true, that buildings are something which appeals to older people, a bit like going to church. You know, you go through your life and you begin to appreciate more the built environment. And there is a great worry, I think, that the younger people aren't interested in these things at all. How are we going to interest these kinds of people? Just want to give you one, if I've still got time, Kate, one example of how this is beginning to play out, I think, increasingly. Now, what you're seeing there is another building on the south bank of London next to the Festival Hall. It's a big, brutalist, nasty building of the 1960s, which kind of architectural obsessives are beginning to love, but most of people don't, which is the Queen Elizabeth and Hayward Gallery. It's been, there have been attempts to alter this piece recently, and it's never been listed. It's never been a listed building. And curiously enough, the reason it hasn't got altered is not because people say, oh, it's Le Corbusier, it's his style, Le Corbusier, and the archigram movement, all frightful scholarly stuff like that. No, the reason it's not got changed is because the skateboarders used it for the Undercroft for skating all around, and immediately there was a threat to all their skateboarding areas, which of course the tourists love to see. They all used the social media and Facebook and started a great campaign, and they got the South Bank board to stop their campaign to change these buildings at all. So, I mean, the irony is, of course, they weren't interested in the buildings qua architectural space at all. They were interested in the activity that went on, their own personal experience. And I think that we have to accept that for younger people, heritage is not something objective which you learn about. It's not about Le Corbusier, it's not about J.J. Reid or whoever it happens to be. It's about them doing something and having fun in the city. And this is just a picture of a bicycle that I happened to park my bicycle next to outside the rather nice Victorian Gothic building I work in London, which I thought sums this point up rather nicely. Urban culture for this young man, I suppose it's a young man, is being on a bike and running around the city and having fun. It's not about looking at a building by Alfred Waterhouse and saying, oh, I do admire that Gothic architecture. And so people are more and more drawn, I think, to activity in buildings rather than just studying them or knowing about them in one way or another. And I think that's something one has to take into account. I think I'm going to leave it there because otherwise I'll have gone over my allotted time. Kate, okay?
We are now going to move into our conversation and discussion, but first I'd like to thank Andrew very much for raising a number of issues that I do think will come up in various ways when we consider Melbourne and take the lessons of London to our own environment. We're going to now hear brief comments from our panel, and I'll introduce them in one go. Mr. Rob Moore is Manager, Urban Design and Docklands Branch here at the City of Melbourne. He's worked with the City of Melbourne for 15 years and trained as an architect. Rob has previously worked in the public and private sectors in the UK, Southern Africa and Australia. We then will hear from Mr. David Rolls, who's Group Executive, Commercial Development at Mirvac, where his role is to deliver and expand Mirvac's commercial pipeline development. And David has over 30 years' experience in property construction, design and development, with a particular focus on complex major mixed-use development projects. And our third panellist is Dr. Kate Shaw, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in Urban Geography and Planning at the University of Melbourne. Her current research focuses on urban renewal in the 21st century, and she has been a commentator on planning at Melbourne, very interested in thinking about the future of Australian cities. And I've asked all three of our panellists to just talk briefly about what is on their mind in relation to urban heritage in Melbourne, and to really highlight some of the points that they think are most pressing. Let's open our conversation first with Robert Moore.
Thanks, Kate. Very interesting to hear what Andrew had to say about London, because it kind of tied in with the thoughts I had over the weekend preparing for my 3 minutes, and I'll try and keep to 3 minutes. It's a complex subject to cover in 3 minutes, but I wanted to cover three aspects of this subject. Firstly, I'll talk about the Hoddle grid, because I feel very passionately about the Hoddle grid and its importance to Melbourne. I want to talk very briefly about the planning scheme that we've got, and it's about this thick, so talking about the planning scheme in 1 minute is tricky, but I'll try and do that. And then I want to talk about what I think we need to concern ourselves if we're going to get to a sustainable city of the future that responds to our heritage. Just on the Hoddle grid, I think we tend to very often when we're thinking about heritage home in on individual buildings, and whilst I completely agree that Melbourne's got some magnificent individual heritage buildings and we care about them a great deal, what's special about Melbourne is actually the Hoddle grid within which a lot of those buildings sit. And it's always struck me as a great pity that we haven't, as we've expanded our city outwards, we haven't actually learnt so much of what is really great about the Hoddle grid and what it offers to the city and makes it a very special city. And I thought over the weekend, you know, one of the reflections, I do a lot of work in Docklands, one of the reflections I've always had about Docklands is how much better that new piece of city would have been if we'd just taken the lessons of the Hoddle grid and rolled that out as a carpet down to the waterfront at Harbour Esplanade. If we hadn't built an urban freeway in the form of Wurundjeri Way next to the railway corridor and actually doubled the width of that barrier to our waterfront, and then placed a rather ridiculous football stadium in the middle of our new city. Hoddle wouldn't have had the MCG in the middle of the Hoddle grid. He put it or somebody sensibly put it on the edge of the Hoddle grid and left the grid intact. We could have had a football stadium in Docklands in a much better location that doesn't actually stop you from getting to the water at Harbour Esplanade. And we're now having to deal with that in retrospect to try and make that work. The point that Andrew made about the way buildings meet the ground was an interesting one, which we've tackled, I think, very well in Melbourne over the years. And certainly back in the mid-80s, we were making all the same mistakes that London makes about how buildings meet the ground badly. Think of Nauru House, many of you would know, Exhibition and Collins, a perfectly reasonable, rather boring kind of octagonal tower building, sitting in a sea of nothing when it actually meets the ground. Windy, windswept public space that's fairly useless. What we did in the mid-80s and late 80s, we started to put very strict controls in place that said, build to your site boundaries and reinforce the Hoddle grid and set your towers back behind podiums that are respectful of the heritage context that you're often building in within the city centre. Sadly, what we're now doing, having learnt that lesson very well, and I think applied it very well with buildings like 101 Collins Street and others, we're now making this mistake of throwing that part of the planning scheme out the window, and we're building towers straight off the street. Sometimes towers on two sides of a 10-metre wide little street, so we're going to end up with canyons of tall towers with windswept, shady streets at the bottom, and an urban context that has actually forgotten what is special about Melbourne's grid. and Melbourne's heritage architecture, which generally set a limit at 40 metres. So we have a typology within Melbourne that showed us how to build tall buildings in the right way and be respectful of the grid. And in recent years, and I say this in probably over the last 3 or 4 years, we've started to ignore those important rules. So my second point, and I'll be very brief on this because I've probably already gone over my 3 minutes, is that I think we really have got to home our planning scheme down from a volume this thick, I'd say, to a volume much thinner, with some very clear statements about what is important and what we really want to focus on if we want a good city of the future. And the last point I just briefly want to touch on, and possibly contest a little bit of what Andrew was saying about garden cities. Garden cities are wonderful things, and suburban life has a lot to offer. But I think one of the context that we're in Melbourne is a little bit different to London, in that we have the lowest density suburbs of just about anywhere in the world, because we started with a very, very generous version of Garden City with the quarter-acre lot. And what all of the studies show is that we need a little bit more density in those suburban areas. And the studies that we've done in the city have shown how we can actually get greater density in the suburbs, leaving 95% of those suburbs completely intact, and focusing density around our transport corridors. And I think that model needs to be re-looked at. Sadly, we thought we'd got a pretty good model on the table. At the last election, the Labor government went into an election arguing for much, much wider corridors than we had envisaged. And quite rightly, people said, we don't want that degree of change, and voted in a political party that have gone down a route that I think is way too conservative. So we've now got a city working on two very different paradigms. The city centre paradigm, which I think is actually getting too dense and is in great danger of killing the very wonderful golden goose of this livable city that we've created over the last 30 years. And that compared with a suburban model which has put residential zones in place that are so restrictive at 2 and 3 stories that we're not going to get the density we need for sustainable suburbs of the future. We're not going to be able to support good public transport in those suburbs, and I don't think we're going to have the livable city in those suburbs in the future. So that's probably well over my 3 minutes. Sorry, Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we'll move on now to David Rolls.
So I'll try and make up for some of your time, Rob. But I agree with what a lot of what Rob said in terms of appropriateness, and the last point around the right place for the right type of density, particularly around transport nodes. But getting back to the city, which was part of the focus of Andrew's presentation, I've been fairly lucky, and I've spent the last dozen years working very closely with Richard Rogers, and spent a couple of years working pretty much out of his office in London for a couple of major projects. And part of the discussion with Richard is making the places that you create inspiring to not only a current generation but a future generation. And you take places like the Pompidou Centre that he did with Renzo, it's still a wonderful place to visit 30 or 40 years after it was created. So I guess the theme of the discussion should be around the opportunity that heritage provides in that type of context. There's cities that have embraced heritage, and Melbourne is one of those very lucky cities that has a great canvas to work with and must be appreciated and endorsed. Cities like Shanghai with the Bund that's been well preserved is the real focus point of Shanghai. Meatpackers District in New York, South Bank in London, and the Tate and what that's done to that part of London creates these wonderful, vibrant places that any generation wants to visit. So, the work that the creators of cities and developers and architects and planners are all part of that creation team need to be very conscious of what heritage can do as a positive contribution to cities, and they need to take the time to understand and embrace what they can do to cities rather than their barriers to entry. And a good example of that from a Mirvac point of view is the approach that we're taking on 477 Collins Street, where we've spent a year looking at what those older fleet buildings were and how relevant they are, and the work we've done is to embrace them and give them a future and retain them. And where you look at those images of how the Gherkin lands in London, we've got a wonderful position with 477 where the older fleet buildings will remain the frontage, they'll get repositioned, refurbishment, and that tower doesn't have to land hard and fast down on Collins Street. So, the work that needs to happen is the dialogue between all the stakeholders, and we've spent a lot of time with the City of Melbourne talking to them about what's important about that particular site in the framework of the city, as well as the department, as well as heritage people, and I think that dialogue's something that needs to be embraced, particularly for Melbourne. My last point relatively is the function of urban regeneration and heritage that gives you that natural grain that when you go to somewhere like Docklands, having been involved in that, you're desperately trying to find the grain and the reason to create the grain when you're putting a new part of the city together. So the Docklands Library, for instance, that again worked very closely with the City of Melbourne and Places Victoria, that is creating a new part of a new precinct, and I wished we'd had a heritage building there to do the same job as what Docklands Library is there to do today. And you need to grab those opportunities, because where we're ending up with urban regeneration is it's all about the place that you want to create and the legacy you create for the people that occupy the building, and heritage provides that grain to create that canvas.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Kate Shaw to complete our panel.
Okay, thank you. I think that the conflict between heritage protection and new development is not necessary. It's really a question of management and key planning decisions and then adhering to them. And certainly there are good examples in Melbourne and certainly elsewhere of successful mergings of the two. The older fleet buildings in the Rialto is a very good example, and there are others. I want to focus on a slightly more specific area tonight, and that is, I think, that an additional concern for Melbourne, additional to the testosterone-fueled high-rise trend that we've already covered tonight, is, and this is a concern not just for Melbourne but for most cities where the property market is heightened with a similar set of contextual conditions that are driving the high-rise apartment boom as well, of course. But this concern is the growing proclivity for very high-end adaptations. So I'm thinking of the Foy and Gibson warehouse residential conversions in Collingwood, for example, or the No. 2 goods shed at Docklands. Elaborate and formal refits such as these necessitate that the buildings be put to highest and best economic use to recoup the costs involved in the refit, almost invariably resulting in high-end residential or office uses, which I think are unfortunate for three reasons. And this unfortunate aspect, of course, applies to not just adaptive reuses, but high-end residential and office use in general. First, they're inequitable. Only the best resourced households and companies can afford to live or work in these buildings.ចឹnd, they're exclusive. They don't invite the public in to admire their extraordinary dimensions, particularly in the cases of heritage refits. Indeed, they actively keep people out with very conspicuous security systems. And they tend not to be compatible with other uses, industrial, creative, participatory. They preclude the liveliness of the genuinely mixed and public uses that allow people to experience and enjoy such places. Third, they actively and actually destroy heritage value. Beyond the beautiful foyers in the Foy and Gibson warehouses, the interiors have been subdivided to within an inch of their life. Being inside an apartment is like being in any new build apartment shell. The sightlines in the old goods sheds are blocked at almost every turn. Nowhere do you get a sense of the original structure's wonderful height and breadth and depth. On this last point, I'm not suggesting that old buildings shouldn't be played around with. While all heritage advocates know that the best treatment is minimal, we don't have to be too precious about it. In my view, the very best adaptive reuses have roughed the buildings up a bit. Abbotsford Convent, the Nicholas building in the city, where hundreds of low-cost tenancies adapt their spaces to suit them. They're a kind of an adaptive reuse of heritage. There's evolving uses going on all the time. Curtin House up the top end of Swanston Street with its bars, restaurants, shops, bookshops, the rooftop cinema. Donkey Wheel House at the bottom of Burke Street, which is full of low-rent paying social enterprises and not-for-profits and arts activities that again have adapted their spaces with a light touch. They're keeping it simple, they're allowing it to evolve, and the lack of formality in the refits enables additions and removals and more adaptations which retain the voice of the original place while allowing new layers to speak too. Such additions can involve extensions, new floors, new parts of buildings where more and different uses are enabled, and there should be no problem with including a residential component in a multi-use venue if the tenants know what they're moving into. This is what heritage protection should be, and I think this is where it can meet with new development. Apart from the really most rare and precious houses and theatres and public buildings, we should be encouraging our urban industrial heritage in particular to live, adding to it, building on it, keeping the additions light and informal, ensuring the new works add to rather than take over the historic structures, and allowing the whole thing to breathe. And the beauty of this approach, of course, is that it doesn't cost much, which keeps the rents low, which means it can fill up with startups and young people and the kind of activities that Andrew was talking about. People doing interesting and wonderful things, which in turn keeps it accessible, because people coming through admiring the place and enjoying the activity are likely to be welcome, as opposed to the rather anodyne corporate office environment of the adaptive uses that I talked about just earlier.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, in the 4 presentations that we've had a huge range of issues. Issues about planning, about heritage adaptation, about vitality of the city, how the city can be accessible, and how new adaptations of heritage buildings can assist with that access and that affordability. And we've also had mention of the relationship between the inner city centre and the suburbs, and what that means in terms of planning and heritage, and much more as well. I won't go through all the themes, but I do think that we were starting to see some clear issues and points of discussion emerge. And so now I'm going to hand it over to the audience tonight to ask some questions of our panel.
Peter Forsyth's my name. Mine's got a fairly broad issue. The radical right-wing high population growth policies that all our state and federal parties and politicians seem to be keen on these days. Rob Moore seemed to be keen on sacrificing some of our garden suburbs. I think he maybe should visit some of the suburbs a little bit, and you'll find out that rather than being not dense enough, we have rather nasty traffic jams through much of the radial and non-radial roads already. And I know the property developers and the real estate investors and the real estate agents all want to make lots of money, but I think it's at the expense of Melbourne's garden, culture, history, heritage and quality of life for most people generally. Could we have a comment?
Okay, so that's a comment really, I think, rather than a question, but it does raise key issues of density, of appropriate density, both in the city and the suburbs, and of course of transport links. And Rob, I wonder if you wanted to comment
look,
on that.
I'm very happy to take that question. The key, in my view, the key to getting greater density in the suburbs is not around a car culture. So we've got to move away from the notion of being able to get in a car, live in the country, live in a suburban environment and get in a car and drive to the city. To do that, we've obviously got to have a very, very different public transport system to the one that we've got at the moment, which is grossly inadequate. And so it does rely on a great deal more investment in public transport so that any increase in density in those suburban areas is actually providing people at the same time with a public transport service that will get them in and out of the city. And importantly, as Andrew pointed out, this isn't just about everyone working in the city centre and moving back to the suburbs. The city needs to be seen as a whole network of places for living and working, and people moving both radially around the city as well as in and out of the city.
Thank you.
Paul Beekman from Melbourne Heritage Action. Melbourne Heritage Action is very passionate about Melbourne and its heritage, of course, but tonight we've spoken about heritage as if there's a shared understanding of what that means. But in Melbourne, I think for a lot of us in the city, we value those parts of the city that would not actually be listed or considered to be heritage assets in the planning scheme particularly. And I think a lot of Melburnians are passionate about their laneways and their small little industrial lanescapes, perhaps to use a word that we've coined. How do we go about protecting those parts of the city that many people would consider to be historic, perhaps even the heart of heritage Melbourne, those small laneway districts and little urban experiences in the middle of the city? How do we protect those when the planning scheme doesn't actually recognise them as heritage as such?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to? Kate, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that. I mean, clearly we do have a planning scheme amendment process, and these sorts of areas that we're talking about ought to be recognised in the planning scheme, and we can participate in that process. I think, more to the point, recognition in a planning scheme and the designation of height controls and so on doesn't appear to be much obstacle to ministerial fit. So we also need a government that actually adheres to the planning scheme. And that's a political question, and that's something that we can all participate in, I think, probably more actively than we do.
I can probably add to that. On a national perspective, all the other cities in Australia are trying to replicate the laneways of Melbourne. So they're a wonderful thing to embrace, endorse, getting the context right and the livability and also the adaptive reuse is really important for a city to actually understand what that means.
Yes.
Could I say something about that from the London point of view? Is that in London you've got a dual system of protection, which I'd be interested to hear what happens here. Is you've got the listed building system, where there are many more listed buildings, no doubt, than there are in Melbourne, but you've also got a conservation area system, which is weaker in terms of the planning protection it gives you, but it is much more popular in neighbourhoods, and it relies for its success very much on participation and people in neighbourhoods having a very strong feeling. Of course, you can get a very NIMBY view of it all. Nevertheless, in residential neighbourhoods, the conservation area aspect of heritage protection is really, in many ways, more important than the listed building protection, because it covers whole significant areas of the city. I don't know whether your conservation area system really works here at all. I'd be interested to hear what you say about that.
We do have heritage overlays, and I think the point that Andrew just made is a really key one. I think where our planning scheme is very weak is on the whole area of public participation and public debate about these matters. And it's something that I'm delighted that our current council within Melbourne is taking on state government on this issue, because what's actually happening in Melbourne is with this planning control, it basically gives the minister the right to decide on any development over 25,000 square metres, coupled with a situation where sites that, frankly, until the last 2 or 3 years, we thought were undevelopable as development sites. We're now finding that the technology and the pressure on land has come such that we're getting very tall, skinny buildings on tiny sites, often picking up on your point about fronting onto laneways. Planning scheme basically thrown out the window. Tall towers, it's remarkable the number of tall schemes we see in the city where a developer comes to us with a proposal for a 20,000 square metre tall, skinny tower on an inappropriate site fronting onto a laneway, and we say, we can't support that, and they go away and add another 10 stories on top of it so that it magically gets above the 25,000 square metres and go along to the Minister for Planning for a permit. Our councillors have said that is not an acceptable way of developing the city, and at least for those smaller sites with smaller scale developments on them, the planning process in the city goes through a public process where you and any other advocates for a particular outcome can actually come to the council and have a public debate about a particular proposal. And that's how I think planning should be. And yes, I do understand that there are major developments, and let's say that might be 50,000 square metres or 100,000 square metres, where it's perfectly reasonable to say that that's a project of state significance where the minister should be able to call in a project and make a decision for state significance. A tall, skinny tower fronting onto a laneway in the middle of Melbourne's CBD, in my view, is not a state significant project. It should go through a public process of debate.
Hi, Matthew Regis. I'm just thinking back on Professor Andrew Saint's talk on London and, of course, Melbourne as well, and looking at, despite entirely different planning schemes, and I guess this could be adapted worldwide, we face similar issues in growing cities in regards to the preservation of heritage. I was wondering if Professor Saint or any of the panel can think of examples worldwide which might be a mechanism which could be adapted across cities to protect that heritage. For example, something from the London planning system that might be easily implemented into the Melbourne.
Oh,
it's really, I'm afraid this is too hard a question for you because I don't know your system well enough. I mean, I think that the point I was just making just now is a very important one. In some areas of London, nearly the whole of the area is covered by conservation legislation. Now, of course, developers hate that. But in fact, I can think of in Kensington and Westminster, both of which are very heritage rich, there is actually plenty of development going on. It's just being played by slightly more polite rules than it is in the city. Now, if you ask why that should be, in one big city you've got different rules, the answer, frankly, is because of the difference in property values in the two places. You know, you could, I'm sure you could draw a graph, and I'm sure people have, showing when you've got the higher property values, then you have much, much more contention on any kind of heritage legislation. And I guess if you are asking to go to a place where the system kind of works well from the heritage point of view, well, you could go to Venice if you like. There ain't no development happening much in Venice. It's all happening in Mestre or something like that. But it doesn't mean to say it's a very healthy city, of course, does it? So I don't think anybody in the audience is going to take the line that the place where there's the least development is necessarily best for the health of the future health of the city.
My question was about borrowed landscapes, and I wanted to thank Professor Saint for his wonderful slide there showing Greenwich with the multi-towered buildings looking onto it and getting the benefit of that beautiful park and architecture. I work at a large public school that is literally being built out all along its perimeters in South Yarra by very, very tall buildings. The school has opposed these buildings. Our school building was built in 1924. It's the most magnificent building in its original site. It's being completely destroyed. Its heritage landscape and value by these buildings that are being built around its perimeter, and not to mention the conflicting land use and the rights of the students. I said to one student the other day playing his iPad at lunchtime, go and run around the Oval. He said, what, the Oval? You mean the arena?
I guess in a curious way, when I was talking at the beginning of my talk about viewing corridors, you could have a policy about these, but I think I'm not optimistic about it being a very successful policy, because you have to decide exactly what views you're going to protect and which aren't, and once you get into tall buildings at all, any buildings higher, any other, are going to come up in the backdrop of others, and I think our experience shows that it's a mess when you try and do that. The only thing you can do, and to be honest, I'm quite reactionary about this, is to have an absolute height limit on the city. Paris has managed to do it. I don't actually think they've put all their buildings out of La Défense, the modern ones really, the high ones, and I don't think actually it's had much effect upon the prosperity of the city. I'm being now a little bit contradictory to the last thing I said, because I said, well, you can't have a Venice-type city, but you can have absolute height limits, and you can have civilized modern cities, I believe. And I'm rather...
Barcelona.
Barcelona's a good example. I don't know exactly what the policies are there, but I think it's worth trying, certainly more than people do at the moment. But of course, in Melbourne and London, the cat is well and truly out the bag by now, I'm afraid.
Just to pick up a point that I think you've all raised, where we have conflict, it really comes out of the confusion of the planning schemes in that people don't know what to expect. So where we have a situation that we're looking to develop along the transport routes, which has traditionally been where we have our heritage, we're inevitably going to have further conflict, because they're also going to be the positions where land values are high, for instance, in the city, and spreading out into the wider metropolitan area. So I guess the question is, how do we get from a position of that conflict to an understanding of what the issues are, and resolving, if you like, that condensed view of what the policy should address, i.e. the important issues. So what's on offer, if you like, going from here forward in terms of that debate and an ongoing conversation that sort of can clear up some of these the misunderstandings, if you like, or the conflicts?
Okay, who wants... David?
I think it's hard to be generic about... I think the issues are so important around the context of each site or each suburb that it's very hard to generalise. I think it's very important to get into the detail of what's important, understand how they relate to what is a broader policy for the city in itself. And you can't get away from actually doing the hard work of understanding the context as it stands, I think.
I'd just like to say that I'm increasingly of the belief that height controls are a good thing. I think we've got to the stage where degrees of discretion have been exercised to such an extent that there is no faith in the planning system as it stands at the moment. Let me just give... I'll give an example in South Bank. South Bank has been divided, and I'll describe this very simply, but there's South Bank Central, where there effectively is no height control. It says 180, 190 metre plus. And then there's an intermediate area that talks about a height control of around 100 metres. And then there's a South Bank Village area that it has always been, or certainly in recent history, a low-rise or medium-rise area. The degree of discretion that's being applied, for instance, in that area that is flagged as being discretionary 100 metres, is allowing towers of 200 metres plus. There is absolutely no point in having height controls if you're going to blow those controls out of the water to that extent. So I think we've got to get back to a system where we have a debate with the community about what is an appropriate height. We agree, if it's going to be a discretionary control, what are the degrees of discretion? And I'd suggest that somewhere around 10 or 20% discretion for genuine benefit that might come back to the community. It might be affordable housing included, and if you add affordable housing, you can put an extra 10% height or bulk into your building. If you had those kind of clear controls in place and everybody agreed that we were going to stick to those controls, I think we'd have some degree of confidence back in society, and whether it's 4 to 8 stories in the transport corridors, and some people might argue that 8's too much and 6 is the right figure. Whatever we agree ultimately is the right figure for those transport corridors, that we all agree that that is the figure, and that somebody can't come along the next day and say, oh, well, if 8's okay, I think 16 stories is okay on this particular site. So I really think we've got to get a lot more certainty back into our planning scheme, and I hope that addresses some of your concerns. But I will just touch on the issue of heritage, because that's actually what we're here to talk about. The model that we put to the Minister for Planning about density along our transport corridors very specifically said that we don't want to see the loss of fine grain, and we don't want to see the loss of heritage buildings along those corridors. So it was very clear that this wasn't just a case of bowling over existing urban fabric along those corridors and building walls of 6- and 8-storey contemporary buildings.
I'd like to comment on that also. I think, particularly with regard to the transit corridors, the University of Melbourne, the Faculty of Architecture, Urban Designers, and there have come up with some interesting modelling that shows that the retention of the existing usually commercially zoned streetscapes with higher rise buildings up to 6 stories set back from the street, not only has quite a high degree of sort of public acceptance, but it would also absorb a considerable amount of the expected demand predicted from population increases. Unfortunately, governments are not inclined to listen closely to universities in this country, which is unusual. You don't find that situation so much in the UK and Europe. But it's also true that the City of Melbourne has done a similar lot of modelling with Rob Adams. So the model, if you like, is there, and it is starting to be discussed. Now, obviously, that would impact most on the inner urban municipalities, and they already do meet. IMAP is a regular meeting of Melbourne City Council and Stonington and Port Phillip and Yarra, I think, and it could be expanded to include the other inner city municipalities. So that discussion should be being had now. And again, I would reiterate my earlier point that we as residents and people who live in these municipalities should really be encouraging our councillors and our councils to participate in these discussions so that we do indeed develop a model that is consistently, broadly agreed upon across the entire inner urban region.
First of all, congratulations on doing this. It's wonderful to actually have the opportunity to be part of this sort of discussion, since in so many of the planning circumstances it's really a few people getting emotional about trying to fight for their own little piece of turf. So that's wonderful. The thing I wanted to mention, though, is that Michael Buxton the other day was saying that we were getting the worst of both possible planning worlds. We're getting the massive density in the inner city that Singapore's getting, and we're also getting the urban sprawl of Los Angeles on the fringes, which I suspect is what happens when you leave it to the market. Professor Saint suggested that we can't tell the developers where to build, but I'm wondering perhaps that's what we want to do. He showed the example of La Defense, where they've basically been told, stay out of our city and you can go over and build there. So my question, I think, is probably best dealt with by the development industry, so Mr. Rolls. Would the development industry be able to cope with being told very specifically where they can be built, where they can build, and what form they can be building in?
Yeah. That's a very good question and a good context within which to ask it. The answer I'd give is Docklands is a fantastic example of an opportunity of where developers can build. Blank canvas. The issue with Docklands is the lack of heritage in bringing it back to the subject. So developers and architects and planners, whoever the creators of the cities are, deal with the planning fabric that they're given, and they're not always the owners of those sites. So it's really up to the city to decide what fabric they want to have and what canvas they want to create. It's a very important discussion to have as a future resident or an occupant for a city.
Okay, so you're saying the answer is yes?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Surprising.
Yes.
If I could add to that, because I meet with a lot of developers at the city and I pose that question to many developers, and the answer from many of them is yes. They actually are asking for planning certainty. That the world we're now operating in Melbourne is actually very difficult for the development industry, because we've got to a situation where it's very, very difficult to actually accurately calculate what a piece of land is worth in this city now. And so what developers are having to do is speculate wildly about what they might be able to get on a piece of land. And that's actually not a good position to be in. And we've seen many proposals come before us in the city where developers say, well, I had no idea what the minister might allow on this piece of land. It is zoned for this, but we figured that so many of the buildings are coming in here. We doubled the value on the offer we made for the piece of land. And therefore it's only reasonable that you accept our proposal. That's not a good way of planning a city. So the smart developers are all saying to us, actually putting decent controls in place and sticking to those controls starts to moderate the market and starts to make development in the city easier for developers, because they know the confines within which they're going to develop.
Mary Drost from Planning Backlash. Rob Moore has made two statements tonight that I'm picking up on. One is, which is a very good thing, he says, he thinks height control is a good thing. And yet, contradicting himself, he criticised the government for bringing in height controls across the suburban areas. Well, let me tell you that the communities who have been lucky enough to get height controls in the suburbs are absolutely delighted. We're sick of the development that's been going on in our suburbs, ruining our heritage, ruining our whole suburban lifestyle. And we agree with you that there should be height controls. We wonder why you're so contradictory on this. And none of us agree that there should be 6 stories along the transport corridors, Kate. That the community...
Oh, that's not
I'm networking with 250 groups across Melbourne, and I think I've got a pretty good idea of what the communities are saying.
Okay.
If I could just... Clearly, the
Why is it contradictory?
I've been accused of being contradictory, so I'll just answer that very briefly to say, clearly, this is about the number. So I'm saying height controls are a good thing. I don't think I contradicted myself there. But what I did say, and I still stand by, is that I'm quite comfortable with possibly 95% of our suburban areas having very strict height controls that don't see significant change. But clearly where we differ, you and I, is over what the appropriate height control is around our transport corridors. And we can have a debate about that, and let's have that debate. But once we've had that debate and we all understand why, if I win the argument, I'd be arguing why I think a little bit more density along our transport corridors would be a good thing for everybody, not only the people in the corridors, but the people in the lower density suburbs, I'll call them the hinterland, either side of those corridors, why that's a good thing. But if we don't actually have that debate in the community, we'll never know what the right answer is. But I stand by my statement that height controls are a good thing. I just think 2 and 3 stories across the whole of the suburban area is an unrealistic expectation and won't lead to a viable, sustainable, public transport-led city of the future.
And I'm afraid I have to stand by our time commitment because as much as I think we'd all like to keep talking, I don't even think I can squeeze in one more comment. I do want to end though with the point that I think just came up in that last question. We do need to have discussions, we do need to have debate in our communities about issues of planning, development and heritage. And I think the point that has been made by our speakers is we need some certainty and some decisions that are made about the future direction of Melbourne and its heritage. So I'd like to thank our panellists very, very much indeed. I think it's been a great privilege to have the insights from Professor Saint about London, but also from our local panellists who are very passionate about the situation in Melbourne and its planning and its development. So thank you to all of our panellists. And on that note, I really just want to add by saying I hope that discussions do go on, conversations go on about the future of Melbourne. So thank you very much to our audience as well.